So our next speaker, I'm pleased to announce, is Ralph Hancock. He holds degrees from BYU and Harvard and has taught political philosophy at Brigham Young University since 1987. He's also president of the John Adams Center for the Study of Faith, Philosophy, and Public Affairs, an independent educational foundation. It lists in his bio his most recent book, which shows that he has other books and many things, many places he's been published. So with that short introduction, I would like to introduce Ralph Hancock.
Thank you, Scott, and thanks to the whole FairMormon crew for all the arrangements and for the honor and the opportunity to speak to you. Some are still deciding whether they want to take a chance with this Hancock guy or not, but that's fine because I'm kind of still deciding just how to leap into this discussion. I've been preparing, organizing some remarks for a while, especially the last week or so. And I might have been better off in some respects just to have stayed home and then come here 5 minutes ago to talk to you, because I'm kind of overstimulated here with all the many excellent, thought-provoking talks that we have heard. And so much that I agree with, occasionally a point that I might want to push back against a bit, but mainly I now have the sense of kind of, with my topic in particular, coming into the conversation a little bit sideways. Especially the conversation, and we've had some extremely thoughtful, substantive contributions to this conversation, the conversation about Mormon apologetics and what it should be and how it might be adapted best to our times and our challenges. I certainly strongly agree with one point that others have duly emphasized already, with many points, but this one particularly, that I think we have a great need to overcome a certain insularity in the certain isolation in the context of our scholarship and in the development, the building of reasoning that contributes to upholding and explaining our faith. We need a richer engagement with other religious and philosophical traditions in order to come to terms exactly with the wealth of truth that I firmly believe we have at our disposal in the restored gospel. And I'm going to try to, in an admittedly imperfect and preliminary way, to illustrate some of the value of that religious and philosophical engagement with other traditions. Well, you've seen my topic already, and I'm committed to talking about it now, I guess. So, you might be asking, I think some of the previous speakers have in effect been asking, why talk about this? Maybe all the issues surrounding the meaning of love in our society and the question of same-sex marriage or marriage equality might be considered, anything along those lines might be considered something in the cart that is definitely surplus and not to be considered essential. Well, I just have to say at the outset, this is where I differ. I think the question surrounding the meaning of love or the relationship of our sexual and familial moral constitution to the gospel of Jesus Christ is fundamental, and a fundamental point of intersection, a point of conflict, a point of engagement with the surrounding culture. So I, in fact, believe that secularism can in some ways be our friend, but in a more fundamental way, that secularism, in its construal of the relationship of sexual morality to the Christian life, is a challenge that must be confronted directly. It seems to me that the secular viewpoint represented in the slogan, "Love Wins," enjoys increasing authority, practical dominance in our society, especially in most of the media and in the intellectual establishment, in academic discourse. And this is where I depart from others in being slightly more suspicious of the academic frame of reference as simply a neutral and friendly and open-minded realm of discourse on matters dear to the heart of Latter-day Saints. I'm an academic. I have lots of academic associates, and few of them in my field are Latter-day Saint, and we have rich discussions across religious and moral differences. But on the whole, I believe that the academic world is increasingly unfriendly to a moral frame of reference that holds firm on certain long-held principles of morality and family structure. So, like others, I am concerned with addressing certain legitimate frustrations that many, especially many younger people, have with the church. But my view is that some of these frustrations are based upon moral interpretations, upon interpretations of moral principles, which are both historically and philosophically very questionable. My point then will not be to insist upon the flawless or rigid authority of the LDS Church or its leaders, but rather I'm facing in the other direction. I'm engaging secularism seriously. I mean to put in question the authority of secularism. Well, is that a thing, or is that just a binary construct that we can get over and move on from? I think it is a thing. And I think it's an important thing. I think secularism on these moral issues is a very important thing to engage and confront. And I think the moral dimension of the gospel certainly is part of a bigger story. It's not a standalone source of meaning, but it's a very essential part of Christianity and a very essential part of the restored gospel. Let's see, this button? Oh, point here, there we go. Well, probably everyone recognizes the resonance of my title, Love Wins, the slogan that became viral as a celebration of the 2015 Supreme Court decision, Obergefell versus Hodges, a decision that held homosexual marriage to be a fundamental right under the Constitution. A similar sensibility is conveyed in the Love Has No Labels propaganda campaign. Have you seen this, watching a ball game or something? And do you recognize the second of my images there, Love? How many recognize the Love Has No? Maybe I watch too much TV, but I've seen it. I've seen it quite a lot. It's a very emotionally and visually effective campaign to suggest that there should be no limits on the legitimacy of what is called love. What let me begin then by asking, what is the thrust of these images, these appeals? I think what they mean to convey is this, that surrounding the question of gay rights and homosexual marriage, there is no difficult question of constitutional law or political philosophy. Love settles these questions. A certain interpretation of love settles the questions so that we should move on from any debate. If you are not against love, these images convey, then you cannot oppose the indefinite expansion of rights protecting sexual expression and affirming a diversity of lifestyles. And who can be against love? Who can be against love? I mean, think about the authority of this idea of love in our supposedly secular culture. It's as if this is the authority of this notion or this feeling seems to be the one residue of Christian civilization that wields amazing authority in our supposedly secular age. So it seemed to me important today, and this is why I've raised this troublesome, potentially annoying question. It seems to me inescapably important today to raise the question of whether a political slogan like love wins or a popular notion such as all you need is love, someone will hear the Beatles singing that song in the background, whether the notion that all you need is love is a legitimate descendant of the biblical teaching, charity never faileth. So I'm not going to directly address the constitutional or philosophical issues surrounding same-sex marriage, but rather the understanding of love in terms of which many people, including Mormons and other Christians, frame their support of this new right. We need to understand what is at stake in this conception of love in order to be clear about what we are discussing, not only regarding the marriage question, but wherever fundamental moral and religious principles are a matter of concern. In a certain way, I guess I would say that this understanding of love, the understanding effective in the love wins mantra, is in a way, the moral center of secularism. And the term love provides a kind of bridge between a Christian and secular view that contributes to much confusion. And so I thought I ought to try to help to sort out that confusion just a bit. No, wrong button. I'm sure I did. There we go. I realize that just by asking what love means, just by raising the question of the meaning of love, I am already taking a position that some find troubling. After all, how can love be the main thing, the preeminent thing, the answer to all questions, if we must first achieve clarity regarding its meaning? It's as if as soon as you ask about its meaning, you are subordinating love to some definition, some reasoned argument. To clarify is inevitably to divide, to separate light from darkness, to invite binaries, whereas love implies unity. By even raising the question of the meaning of love, I might seem to be ranking clarity above charity, light above love. Now, I take this problem very seriously. I want to acknowledge this conundrum from the outset. If it has any answer, I hope that my presentation will help to begin to bring it to light. In the meantime, let me justify my questioning of love by noting that we all seem to be here, at FairMormon because we think that it is good to reason together. We must then have faith and hope that reasoning together, distinguishing and discerning, somehow contributes to love, that light and love somehow converge. This convergence would seem to be a necessary condition of speaking the truth in love. Reminding you of a quote from Elder Maxwell earlier in this conference. Speaking the truth in love. Both truth and love have to be in play, in other words. On the other hand, for those whose idea of truth is that of an evolutionary and progressive dialogue, a progress of progression more than a discernible outcome, then you might indulge the present attempt of mine at clarity just as a little moment in that process of faithful dialectic. Now, before I consider some LDS examples of the love wins mentality as I see them, I want to acknowledge the difficulty of the moral and philosophical problem presented by the revolutionary Christian notion, the authentic and original Christian notion of charity as somehow surpassing all natural ethical concerns. So I mean to acknowledge at the outset that there are genuine philosophical and theological difficulties in sorting out the relationship between love and morality more generally, love and the other virtues. The central problem, I think, just to simplify in a way that I hope will be useful, the central problem behind the confusing relationship between Christian charity and secular love is the tension between substance and universalism. Recently, I was conversing with an earnest and faithful young LDS scholar about the intersection between the church and the secular world, and I began, as I am wont to do, to defend or to make the simple, if you will, orthodox case for the importance of defending a clear moral standard and a family ideal in a relativistic world. This young man's heartfelt reply was, "Don't you want the church to be available to the widest possible group, even to all of humanity? Does it not hinder the universal mission of the church to insist on barriers?" Another young, faithful LDS scholar was recently emphasizing the importance of compassion towards those who struggle with church teachings on sexual morality. Someone asked him, well then, would not sharing the principle of repentance be an important expression of love for a struggling neighbor? No, he replied. If anyone needs repentance, it's not the person struggling with sexual morality. The one needing repentance would only be the person who would presume to appeal to a principle higher than the feelings of the person who is struggling. So these are two very powerful notions today, universalism or inclusiveness and compassion. Both of these thoughtful and faithful Latter-day Saints were effectively, it seems to me, falling in with the love wins mentality. Not, I think, out of any particular enthusiasm for sexual liberation or revolution in family structure, but according to the logic of universalism, inclusiveness, which indeed seems to be a defining gesture of the gospel, and especially of Paul's letters. It seems to me, though, that there's a pretty simple logical problem with, if you will, again, excuse me for appealing to logic, a simple logical problem with this movement of thought. Universalism is by itself empty and meaningless. There must be some content, some substance to be universalized, something to be shared. If you want to share, you have to have something to share. Every outreach presupposes an affirmation, every extension a center, every movement of compassion some understanding of the good, of what it would mean to heal and to be whole. The enthusiasm for inclusiveness or the movement of compassion without regard to content is not only ultimately religiously suicidal, I would say, but logically incoherent. Now, to move towards more developed Latter-day Saint examples, published examples. In order to show that my concern for the love wins mentality among Latter-day Saints is not misplaced, I need to share some specific named examples of this tendency. That is to say, that the nonpartisanship in the gospel that we all hope for is harder to achieve than is sometimes thought. We can't just wave a wand and say, can't we all just get along? We have to come to a unity of the faith. And my frank opinion is that the love wins mentality and the moral framework it implies is an impediment to this unity of the faith. So I'm in favor of nonpartisanship as a goal, but we have to do the hard work of considering the intellectual facts on the ground and confronting them, engaging them. The questions that I will raise have nothing to do with the character or good faith of my interlocutors, but only with their arguments, which I will try to present as fairly as can be done in a brief space, knowing well that this will not be either my last word or that of my interlocutors. I know that for some, the imperative of love would require passing over things I disagree with in silence. Some would regard even entering into this topic as an example of forensics or polemics. Can we not just move beyond this? But I think that the motive of love risks lapsing into an attitude of easy tolerance. Move on, there's nothing to see here. In fact, I think there is something important to see, and we have to look at it. Again, my faith and hope are in the convergence of light and love, and right now I hope to contribute a little to the light without detracting, of course, from the love. So my first example is that of an argument made by Blair D. Hodges, who received a master's degree in religious studies from Georgetown and now serves at BYU's Maxwell Institute as public communication specialist and in editorial roles. I think Blair is probably here today, and I hope that he will regard my remarks as a continuation of our civil discussions. The argument of Blair's that I'm addressing was not made in his BYU capacity, I should make clear, but as a prominent blogger at By Common Consent. Responding on that site to an example used by Elder Anderson concerning the challenges an LDS teenager faced in standing up for her, quote, belief in marriage between a man and a woman, Mr. Hodges proposes a different version of such an experience in which the girl instead wishes to defend her belief in marriage equality. Now notice that the premise of Brother Hodges' argument is the equivalence of these two experiences, as if it were arbitrary or accidental that Elder Anderson was offering support to the girl defending a specific LDS teaching. Of course, Elder Anderson would certainly counsel, as church leaders have often counseled, that we treat those who contradict church teachings with courtesy, respect, and indeed love. But this takes nothing away from the apostles' clear intention, in the piece cited by Hodges, the Elder Anderson's clear intention to contribute to the defense of true teachings and not to compromise with a significant and dangerous error. I just used the word truth and error, which are not as much in fashion as they used to be. Hodges goes on to defend the equivalence between the two girls' cases, one favoring real marriage, the other marriage equality, by invoking love for one another as the only reliable indicator of our Christian discipleship. But now you see that I've posted this quotation on the slide. The only reliable indicator. Of course, the statement itself is incontrovertible, but the whole question concerns the status of particular commandments and principles in relation to the great and ultimate idea of love. Hodges disposes of this question with this decisive affirmation. If we can be united on this one single idea, we will be united in the one thing that ultimately matters. The one thing. There's one thing that ultimately matters. Hodges, citing Scripture, he thus counsels us to regard all opinions on matters such as gay marriage and abortion as personal perspectives that admit of no certainty and that don't ultimately matter anyway. Since we don't have perfect knowledge, it seems we should consider love to be the only absolute truth. And this, then, is a love that has been severed from any opinion we may have about such things as commandments and purposes. Of course, if Mr. Hodges were merely saying that all our dealings with other human beings, especially our fellow saints, should be informed by love, then he would be saying something very true and very uncontroversial. But he is saying more than that. In the guise of claiming, in the notion of love, a higher ground above all mere opinions, liberal and conservative, he is in fact laying out what seems to me an aggressively liberal position, a position of effective relativism. We can't know if Elder Anderson is right or if the girl favoring gay marriage is right, so let's put them on the ground of equal ignorance of the ultimate truth. Since we could be wrong about any particular subject, but not, it seems, about something called love, we can be wrong about everything but that, our beliefs concerning the content of God's love for us, that is, concerning his plan for us, must not enter into the way we show love. If we are ignorant of the ultimate truth, then how can we really object to anyone's preferences, since all these preferences are equal? And why would we ever presume to offer correction to someone who just happens to find himself, quote, in a minority position within the church? So I conclude that Blair Hodges' plain debunking of knowledge, particularly knowledge of moral standards, in favor of love, his severing of love from knowledge of right and wrong, good and bad, is a clear example of the appeal for Mormons of the secular love wins idea. Excuse me. Was it Marco Rubio who messed up by taking a drink like that? So we're all careful about that since that happened. Another good example of the love wins mentality in Mormonism was a recent post at Time and Seasons by Craig Harleen, BYU history professor, entitled "Going All Sorts of Gentile." Harleen's argument illustrates how a certain interpretation of Paul is central to the love wins argument. I think I'll rest content with the quotations that I've posted for you. If you're going to go to people you think are strangers and invite them to join you and stay with you, then you have to really go to them instead of expecting them to do things just the way you do. So all the emphasis is upon inclusion, upon spreading, not upon the content or the center. We may need to make a wholesale change and rethink even certainly apparently non-negotiable, unmissable ways in order to help accommodate people you'd thought were strangers, because your mutual hope and love in Jesus rose above all that. Love trumps everything. Or better yet, underlay it like some big pillow, softening everything. That's a nice one. The love wins argument is apt to wrong foot anyone inclined to counter it, since no one wants to be against love. But Tom Spencer, it happens, a BYU German professor, has ventured to question this rhetoric of relativistic love in an article forthcoming at Meridian Magazine Expand. Harleen, Spencer argues, has in fact set himself outside the realm of sincere discussion of the content of belief, because he has already declared the common ground of content-indifferent Jesus-believing to be in fact the whole ground. For Harleen, the gospel boy is down to a social form, the form of the Jesus community, that has no necessary connection to any particular content, which is why all specific commandments or doctrines can be changed. In Spencer's opinion, then, and mine, I don't mind saying, the transformation of eternal truths into you just thought they were eternal truths is categorically incompatible with basic Mormon theology. The same love wins philosophy is evident in Professor Harleen's book, Conversions. Here I cite the review in BYU's Mormon Studies Review by Randall Balmer of Dartmouth. A little background on the book. In Harleen's book, a young man, a Mormon convert, struggles with what he considers to be his homosexual identity in its tension with his own Mormonism, which he eventually chooses to abandon, and also in his conflict with his parents' evangelical faith. Fortunately, from both Harleen's and Balmer's point of view, the apparent conflict between being evangelical and being Mormon, as well as that conflict between being Mormon and being a proudly practicing homosexual, can be happily resolved. This resolution, to resolve these tensions, Harleen draws on two worldviews that one might have thought quite distinct, but that Balmer's Harleen now forges into a powerful alliance. We see here a certain union between secularism and a new Christian understanding of love. First, the reconciliation of former religious and moral tensions has something to do, this is A on my slide, with the cultural diversity of the Enlightenment or the postmodern validation of an infinite variety of experiences. Second, or B, there is the theological discovery of the New Testament teaching that love trumps all, a capacious teaching that enables the overcoming of the premise of dogma. Thus we see that the alliance of enlightened postmodern diversity with a new love produces a miracle of reconciliation, a miracle that saves Michael's parents from having to choose between their conservative evangelical beliefs or affiliations and their loyalty to their son. Postmodern love thus allows evangelicals and Mormons to move beyond mere tolerance, Harleen writes, to a willing embrace of the other. That is, an embrace, I infer, that abandons all reference to any demanding moral dogma and thus to the need for repentance. Such is the happy ending. I note that it is touted without critique in BYU's Mormon Studies Review. Love wins, indeed. Nothing to see here. Move on. Mormonism must adapt to changing times. Get on the right side of history. My third example is more philosophically challenging, more subtle, and I think I'll largely skip it because I'll run out of time anyway, and you'll see that I have reviewed Adam Miller at MormonInterpreter.com in recent weeks. I'll just skip to my concluding points that Miller excludes any ranking of goods and the idea of our working towards another better world. My argument is that Miller does not explicitly throw his considerable philosophical weight behind the Love Wins campaign, but his philosophy, like the popular Pauline rhetoric of Harleen and Hodges, tends to strip the restored gospel of its most distinctive and beautiful promises, and to thus disarm moral effort in opposition to what I consider at least the relativistic distortion of love. The leveling in Adam Miller's work of all desires to the sheer grace or gratuity of what God has given implies the equality of all natural desires and indeed the sinfulness of any effort to attain righteousness, that is, at least righteousness in the sense of governing lower desires in view of a higher hope. Gratitude for the world, a big theme of Adam Miller's, gratitude for the world just as it is becomes hard to distinguish in practice, I would say, from worldliness. So those are my three LDS examples. I trust that for some at least here, the costs of the reading of Christian charity in the Love Wins manner may be obvious, But again, I want to emphasize that a diagnosis or genealogy of this disorder proves to be a challenging task. The philosophical and theological roots of a certain confusion between secularism and Christianity lie deep in the history of Western thought and are entangled in the very foundations of the modern age. This, in some way, I guess, is the most demanding theme of my talk. It's kind of the line of work that I'm in, teaching political philosophy, the interpretation of the modern age, a kind of genealogy of modern ideas through the history of Christianity and the Enlightenment and so forth. To uncover these roots is a monumental task, and here I can offer only a few glimpses, and I may end up abbreviating even those glimpses that I have prepared. But what I mean to suggest is that the young scholars whose casual conversations I cited at the outset are not alone in their quandary of confusing universalism and compassion with love. Since the tension between the universalizing form of Christianity and its particular content has been a challenge from the beginning. Christianity historically is indeed implicated in the universalistic movement of the West and therefore in the production of secularism. To spread the gospel beyond all ethnic and political borders while holding firm to some substance of what is to be shared is a problem coeval with the announcement of the good news, of the universal good news. And it's a problem that by which one can in fact trace the history of Western thought as the story of this problem. Let me just bring this history into focus, and I can barely try to trace it here today. I sense it would be reasonable for you to be wondering, why do we need to talk about the history of the West to get clear on this? Well, I'm fond of it, and it's kind of what I do. But I want to suggest how deep the problem lies, historically, philosophically, and theologically. In this way, I'm paying respect to those with whom I differ on the interpretation of love. At a deep level, the question gets muddled, and there's reason that can be uncovered in our history for the fusion of Christian and secular motives of love. But let me suggest that we can bring this history of Christianity and secularism in the West into focus by observing that there are two kinds of particularism, two elements of particularism, two sources of moral content or substance that Christian universalism must aim to overcome. You see I've represented them on the slide. First, there is the particularism of the Jews, a chosen people defined by a rigorous revealed law. Second, there is the natural particularism of our political condition, the fact that we are raised in and formed by and have allegiance to particular authoritative political and cultural communities. Communities that were authoritatively described by Aristotle. The natural virtues have a universal aspect, but they are always bound up with the common good of particular cities or particular political communities, or more particularly with the ruling ethos of these communities. This is the great insight of Greek political philosophy. So Christian universalism, in its aim to spread the good news without cultural barriers, Christian universalism thus necessarily confronts, on the one hand, the particular claims of the revealed law and natural virtue, prior revelation and proud reason, or you can say Jerusalem and Athens. The problem is that if Christianity is too successful in confronting the claims of Jerusalem and Athens, the law and virtue, then it risks undermining, hollowing out its own content. As I've mentioned earlier, the letters of Paul are a major part of the beginning of this story of the problem between Christianity and universalism ultimately tending towards secularism. It's a question in the interpretation of Paul, just what is the meaning of the fulfillment of the law? And I don't have any original teaching on this question. Is the law that has defined a chosen covenant people no longer in effect, and just in what sense? In many passages, Paul speaks boldly of the law that defined the covenant of Israel as being suspended or rendered inoperative, but he also speaks of he also speaks of Christian love as fulfilling the law. So the status of the law or of commandments in relation to the gospel's announcement of love, and that includes the whole human race, has been a tortured question in Christian theology from the very beginning. Let me just mention that the extreme anti-Jewish view on the question was taught very early in the 2nd century by a certain Marcion, who took Paul's writings to be foundational and used them to dismiss everything Jewish as completely foreign to Christianity, and thus to utterly reject the Old Testament, its commandments, and even its God. I think we can hear echoes of these tendencies today in the love wins mentality. One could say that in this key respect, the love wins movement of the 21st century is a kind of 21st century revival of Marcionism. As my next glimpse at this tortured history of Christian universalism would be a discussion of St. Augustine, or Augustine of Hippo, bishop of in the city of Hippo in North Africa. St. Augustine was, of course, no Marcionite. He respected the canonical status of the Old Testament while interpreting it in a highly allegorical manner. The main concern of Augustine's universalizing effort was not with the particular demands of the Jewish law, but with the status of natural or pagan virtue in relation to the otherworldly faith of Christianity. His great book, his greatest, I suppose, The City of God, is written as an engagement, a confrontation with the city of man, represented by the great Roman Empire. How do the virtues of Rome, the virtues of the pagans, the virtues praised by the philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, how do they stand in a Christian framework? And Augustine summed up his view with this famous declaration: the virtues of the pagans are but splendid vices, fancy sins, basically. Since for Augustine, man cannot achieve the good by his own natural power, both Plato's claim to philosophical salvation and the more common human virtues praised by Aristotle as intrinsically good necessarily appear as merely socially and politically useful. They're not vouched for by Christian theology per se. The ordinary natural or political virtues are splendid vices of merely utilitarian value. In Augustine, we see the tendency of Christianity to supernaturalize the goods of the soul, to refer them to another world, you might say to kick them upstairs, the common and natural virtues of the soul, and thus to interpret this world as the realm only of bodily needs and of vain pretensions. The natural virtues that humans everywhere tend to praise are thus debunked, and one can say reduced to a secular perspective of merely instrumental value. So the work of secularization within Christianity, you can see it moving forward in a way even in the thought of the very otherworldly Augustine. So where then is Christianity's moral content? This is the risk inherent in universalism that I pointed to earlier. Has the Jewish law been surpassed? Have natural virtues been debunked? Without Jerusalem or Athens, what is left at the core of the Christian moral vision? What is the content of Christian morality? What is the practical meaning of love? Against this background, I would suggest that we can interpret modern secularism. The idea is not original with me. You can find it in the work of the French political philosopher Pierre Manent, M-A-N-E-N-T, most notably. But I would suggest that modern secularism can be seen as a result of the mutually eroding interaction between Christian faith and pagan reason. The last 2 points on my slide now. On the one hand, Christian humility opposes the pride of reason and wears it down. On the other hand, critical reason tears down the supernatural claims of Christianity. The resultant rationalism, what's left after this hollowing out, is a rationalism that preserves neither the content of Jerusalem nor that of Athens, but only the open-ended promise of progress, of an ongoing liberation by human means from the limitations of the human condition. I think I'll skip one slide to go right to my example of a founding philosopher of the modern project in René Descartes of the 17th century, as you see. The mobilization of Christian motives for secular progress is already clear in the rhetoric of the philosopher regarded as the founder of the modern age. He helps us to see what we're left with once Jewish law and pagan virtue have done their work against each other. In his discourse on the method, Descartes crafts a story of his path of discovery and appeals to the public for support of his new scientific and humanitarian project. His aim, he says, is to demonstrate the advantages of his scientific approach, so, I quote, as to induce all who have the common good of man at heart, that is, all who are virtuous in truth and not merely in appearance, all who really love, all who put love first, you could say, to induce all such to support his project. Descartes appeals explicitly to a secularized law of humanitarian love, arguing that we must not sin, he uses the word sin, we must not sin against the law. This is not at all the Jewish law or any Christian law per se, but the law by which we are bound to promote, as far as in us lies, the general good of mankind, the general good of mankind. And what is the meaning of the general good? It can't be either Jerusalem or Athens, the law, the commandment, or virtue. The general good of mankind can only mean progress in the material liberation of mankind. We can avoid this sin against humanity only by cooperating in Descartes' project that aims to render ourselves the lords or masters and possessors of nature. That is, we can only really make our true effective, not imaginary or opinionated or vain, but our true effective love of mankind viable and effective by recognizing that we are not limited by any natural or divine law, by any commandment, or by any natural idea of virtue. So my argument is that there is a direct line between the detachment of human love from both the commands of law and the natural virtues and the humanistic and technological project of mastery over nature and the overcoming of the limitations of the human condition. The subversion of charity by the secular ethic of love wins is thus not just a mistake. I think it is the mistake. That's why I think I have to talk about it. It is the mistake because it represents the substitution of the one true thing, Christian charity, by its alluring counterfeit, secular humanistic love. Well, you may have noticed that Elder Oaks has spoken recently of the religion of secularism in some quite striking terms, an article from Ensign magazine, for example. The denial of God or the downplaying of his role in human affairs that began in the Renaissance has become pervasive today. It's not just side element of some secular worldviews. It is what's happening. It is what is driving the movement, I would say the overwhelming movement of secularism. While the glorifying of human reasoning has had good and bad effects, a worthy admission, Elder Oaks explains, prophecies of the last days foretell great opposition to inspired truth and action. Some of these prophecies concern the Antichrist, and others speak of the great and abominable church. The core teaching of this great and abominable church, which must be something far more pervasive, he says, and widespread than a single church, as we understand that term today, is linked in Elder Oaks' argument with the assertions of Korihor in the Book of Mormon, and therefore with moral relativism. Continuing on with Elder Oaks, and I hope I don't have to apologize for quoting a general authority. Today we call Korihor's philosophy moral relativism. This is the belief applied by many in the popular media and in response to peer pressure. Break free of the old rules. Do what feels good to you. There is no accountability beyond what man's laws or public disapproval impose on those who are caught. Now, behind such ideas is the assumption that there is no God, or if there is, he has given no commandments that apply to us today. God is reduced to love, and love involves no commandments. It's quite convenient, and the barrier between Christianity and secularism collapses. He goes on to say that this secular tendency is very influential, explicitly or inadvertently, in the academy, in colleges and universities. Now, lest you regard Elder Oaks' association of secular humanism with the Antichrist, he said it, I didn't. I'm repeating it, blame me for that much. If you regard this as out there, consider that Pope Benedict, a great philosopher and theologian, you see me outreaching to other religious traditions, just what I do. Pope Benedict made a similar argument in his chapter on the temptation of Christ in his book, Jesus of Nazareth. Moral posturing is part and parcel of temptation. It does not invite us directly to do evil. No, that would be far too blatant, excuse the typo. It pretends to show us a better way, where we finally, lots of typos here, where we finally abandon our illusions and throw ourselves into the work of actually making the world a better place. It claims, moreover, to speak for true realism. What's real is what is right there in front of us, power and bread. Does not the Redeemer of the world have to prove his credentials by feeding everyone? Isn't the problem of feeding the world, or you might say of affirming all lifestyles, more generally, are not all social problems the primary, the true yardstick by which redemption has to be measured? The fact is that scriptural exegesis, think of the liberationist distortions of Paul, can become a tool of the Antichrist. The same point can be made with the great Catholic novelist Flannery O'Connor, if we had more time. But let me just say that no Latter-day Saint should be surprised by the conjunction of a universalism that denies moral opposition and thus agency on the one hand, and the project of the adversary on the other. Behold, send me, I will be thy son, and I will redeem all mankind, that one soul shall not be lost, and surely, I can guarantee this, that's the technological motif. We can make this happen if you give us the power. Wherefore, give me thine honor. Amoral universalism has always been and always will be the work of the adversary. Now, just a minute to go over a few pages where I suggest to you some philosophical and historical resources for responding to the humanistic subversion of charity. I would mention Christian authors in the tradition of Thomas Aquinas, who do not deploy against each other, but bring together classical virtue and Christian humility. And I named some names there, but I also want to mention that careful attention to Christian scripture, indeed with the help of non-LDS scholars, can be a great boon. And here I'm happy to be on the same page with one of my colleagues here in recommending the work of N.T. Wright. I mean, his reading of Paul should be a godsend to Mormons who are looking for ways to resist the hollow interpretation of Pauline Universalism that I have cited. Let's just take the last quotation on this slide. If they, Christians, are called to be God's free and freedom-bringing people, then they must learn to live as God's free people, giving up the habit of slavery. Yes, slavery is as much a habit of mind as a physical state. And learning the art of responsible free living. To put it another way, if these people are to take redemptive responsibility for the whole of creation, they must anticipate that one bit of creation over which they have the most obvious control, namely their own bodies. I have many more juicy quotations from Paul, but let's just notice that he says that Paul is firmly endorsing the ancient Jewish prohibition of sexual relationship of any sort outside the lifelong marriage of a man and a woman. And at the end of my second quote, the love of which Paul speaks is tough. In fact, it's the toughest thing there is. It's not easy, tolerant, a slack admission of diversity. The love of which Paul speaks is clearly a virtue. This understanding of love seems to me to cohere very well with the eloquent recent sermon on the gift of grace by President Uchtdorf. But the grace of God does not merely restore us to our previous innocent state. If salvation means only erasing our mistakes and sins, then salvation, as wonderful as it is, does not fulfill the Father's aspirations for us. His aim is much higher. He wants his sons and daughters to become like him. Skipping down to the fourth item. To inherit this glory, we need more than an unlocked gate. We must enter through this gate, that's an action, a response of ours, with a heart's desire to be changed, a change so dramatic that the scriptures describe it as being born again. To a state of righteousness, being redeemed of God, becoming his sons and daughters. Throughout our lives, God's grace bestows temporal blessings and spiritual gifts that magnify our abilities and enrich our lives. His grace refines us. His grace helps us become our best selves. It's not an alternative to striving to be morally our best selves. Let me conclude with the powerful message by Elder Harleen, The Cost and Blessings of Discipleship. And frankly, if we could grasp the import of what Elder Harleen says here, then I wouldn't need to construct these arguments because they already would have been made, or they would be a moot point. Quoting Elder Harleen, sadly enough, my young friends, it is a characteristic of our age that if people want any gods at all, they want them to be gods who do not demand much. God who give us a soft pillow of love upon which to commune. The talk about man creating God in his own image. Jesus said not only should we not break commandments, but we should not even think about breaking them. And if we do think about breaking them, we have already broken them in our hearts. Does that sound like comfortable doctrine, easy on the ear and popular down at the village love-in, or popular with the ethic of love wins, I would venture to add? Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you, to make certain they understood exactly what kind of love that was. We have to be clear about what kind of love deserves to win and will win. He said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Christ-like love is the greatest need we have on this planet, in part, I'm still quoting, because righteousness was always supposed to accompany it. Love is not different from and above righteousness. Righteousness must accompany love. So if love is to be our watchword, as it must be, then by the word of him who is love personified, we must forsake transgression, and get this, and any hint of advocacy for it in others. Jesus clearly understood what many in our modern culture seem to forget, that there is a crucial difference between the commandment to forgive sin, which he had an infinite capacity to do, and the warning against condoning it, which he never ever did even once. With that, let me just include by repeating Elder Harlan's central point. He said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." Thank you. A criticism of my reading of Paul. I didn't really give a reading. I just promote N.T. Wright as a good source who keeps righteousness and justification together. Oh, this one's a real essay. Oh, it intrigues me, but a reference to a book I don't know. Oh, still a book I don't know. Who would have thunk? Do you see a scriptural solution to the challenge of secular love versus love in marriage to produce children? Well, I think we need modern revelation and the guidance of prophets, as well as sound philosophy can be helpful, but I do think a corrective reading of the scriptures, especially Paul, can be useful. Somebody's just agreeing with me. I like about that. I like when that happens. You can say people are more important than principles, but people need to be informed of the consequences of their violation of principles. We agree on that. Could part of the problem be a lack of clarity on what love we are talking about? Yes, I've tried to contribute somewhat to clarity. Somebody's thanking me. I'm going to save that one, okay? I think you and Grant Hardy used the word secular in two different senses. Is that possible? Could that be possible? Well, yeah, it's a part of my point is to show how slippery and fluid the word is. Secular comes from a word about the age or the times, and by secular I mean what is dominant in the world apart from the gospel, and I've tried to point up what I think is a very dominant figure. Grant's understanding of secular, we'll have to talk about this, seems to be more neutral and seems to associate secularism with open-mindedness and carefully researched and critical thinking, discussion, and so forth. But I think it's more than that. See? I think that few forums are neutral, and certainly the dominant forums in the academic disciplines are more and more shaped by a certain ethic, which is at least closely associated with what I have called love wins. Let me just end with this example. I have asserted in print, and I'll say it again because it seems relevant now. It's very true, as has been noted, that in the pluralistic postmodern academy, there is a kind of easygoingness about theological beliefs and commitments. So if you're religious, if you believe, say, in the resurrection of Christ, and maybe you even believe in gold plates and announcing angels and so forth, that can be tolerated. If you're a graduate student, for example, or a young untenured professor, even at secular institutions, most of the time, I imagine, you would get away with such exotic beliefs. But you know what you wouldn't get away with? You would likely not get away with publicly countering the love wins mentality. You would not get away with publicly standing up for a Latter-day Saint teaching on sexual morality and on the family. You would likely spoil your graduate program or ruin your chances to get tenure in many cases. That, I think, is an effect of the secularism that I'm talking about. Thank you.